was an undergraduate, I majored in political science. But then I changed my double major to finance and Russian, thinking I'd do international business. But then in my senior year, I took a marketing class, a giant mega class of 800 students, and I fell in love. Later, when I told my dad, an engineer, that I wanted to do a PhD in marketing, he threw up his hands and said, "But I thought you were smart." And I've had a long career of explaining to people why marketing is a much maligned science. It seems like a frivolous activity of selling sugary soft drinks to people who don't need them or want them. But marketing is critical. It's all about making choices. And it tells us how people make choices, make good choices, and what they experience from those choices. It's a science that actually matters to all of us. And it especially matters in times of change. Now, my own personal field is in consumer behavior, which I would argue is the most fascinating topic you can study in college, and I'll arm wrestle any finance professor who tells you differently. I love consumer behavior. It's all about the big, complex nature of the choices we make and what we consume and how it impacts our lives. I have studied the psychology of innovation for my career, and what I look at is all of the things that impact us in times of change. This time of change in COVID has been particularly interesting to me because innovation and psychology and consumer theory is particularly interesting and important when we're in a time of change. From little things like wearing masks to slightly more complex shifts like shifting to telehealth, to even more futuristic changes like remote surgeries, where a surgeon in one city performs complex surgeries on a patient in another part of the world. We're making big changes fast because of COVID-19, and it's interesting to see how we're adapting and what the world is bringing us. Let's start off with an example. So if you were in my class, I would send you a survey about a week before class to ask you about some simple day-to-day choices. In one scenario, I would ask you about artichoke hearts. I would give you this story. Imagine you're going over to a friend's house for a casual dinner. They ask you to stop at the store, buy artichokes, they've forgotten them, and they need them for their recipe. You say, sure, no problem. And suddenly there you are standing in the store making the choice. Now you don't know artichoke hearts very well, you don't know their brands or their price points, but here are your three options. The Polar brand, the Reese brand, and the Delalo brand. Now, which do you choose? If you're like my classes, there's a good chance that you chose the middle option. As you can see, the large majority of people chose that one. It's very common. It's what's known as a decision heuristic, meaning a rule of thumb that people use to make faster decisions. It's a decision heuristic called the compromise effect. The compromise effect is our human tendency to choose middle options. Now, a lot of decision heuristics may seem irrational, but they are indeed often derived from very rational philosophies. In this case, the compromise effect is simply our own human intuition of a normal distribution, a bell curve. Normal choices are in the middle, weird choices are on the edges. And so in this case, not knowing artichokes, we try to choose the most normal artichoke. Now, this is a really interesting situation because what if you're one of those choices on the fringe? How can you be chosen more often? Well, one way to do it would be to try and structure your pricing so that you were a middle option. And yet, consider a second array. So in my class, in my survey, half of the students are shown that first array with 3 options. The other half are shown an array with 4 options. The fourth option is the Matisse brand, much more expensive. Now, for those students who see this array, how do choices change? The option that was previously a fringe option, that is now a middle option or a compromise option, changes dramatically in its choice share. A small change in the context, absolutely no change in that chosen option, and we see a big shift in what consumers choose. Now, the reason why I include this survey for my students is that I teach undergraduates, but I also teach a lot of graduate students, professionals, people who are working in fields that are very logically oriented, like engineering. I'm even teaching doctors and nurses and hospital administrators. And what they often do when I teach them about heuristics is they say, oh yes, I can see how people would use that rule of thumb, that trick, that illogical little thing. I wouldn't do it, but I can see how people would do it. And I say, no, we all do it. We all use decision heuristics, and they say, no, I'm an engineer, I'm logical. And so I like to have these class data to show them that we all use these decision heuristics. This is something that is a non-conscious layer to all the choices that we make. Many people might think that things like the compromise effect are just common knowledge. Makes sense. Human intuition. However, lots of companies, even the most savvy marketers in the world, sometimes fail to take these decision heuristics into account. Let's consider Starbucks. Starbucks is one of the most sophisticated marketing machines in the United States. And they once made a mistake with the compromise effect. They have their 3 almost famous sizes, which I still insist on calling small, medium, and large. But in 2008, they received a lot of competition from McDonald's, who in that year launched the McCafe brand to sell more quality coffee at McDonald's for a more reasonable price. Starbucks felt threatened. Should they also sell a $1 cup of coffee? Well, they decided to try it, and they came out with a smaller size. Now just look at the visual illusion presented by that switch from 3 sizes to 4 sizes. In the beginning, the 3 sizes seem, reasonable, what we're used to. The small is small, the medium is a decent sized cup of coffee, and the large is generous. But when that 4th option comes in, it suddenly makes the others look different. Now the small looks like a decent sized cup of coffee, the medium size looks generous, and the large size looks like something that's only necessary for long distance truckers and medical residents. It feels too big. Not surprisingly, after a year, the smallest option went away. Starbucks did not say why. But I think they learned from their mistake, because not long after, they added a size to their 3 sizes of frozen drinks, and you'll see that they added a larger size. Again, the optical illusion prevails. What used to seem like a very large frozen drink suddenly seems reasonable because there is an even larger option. Think about how sizes in soft drinks and popcorn have changed in the movies over the years, or at gas stations. It is possible to buy a 64-ounce cup of coffee. Now, that may feel crazy, but what it does is it makes the 32-ounce cup of coffee look pretty normal. So think about how this compromise effect impacts us in the times of COVID. Think about how you might really be craving Dame's chicken and waffles. And you might think to yourself, finally, I can have chicken and waffles again. And so you think of a couple of options. You can go out and get takeout and bring it back to your house to eat. You could get takeout and take it to a park, someplace with lots of big, open, airy spaces to eat. Or you could consider eating in outdoor seating at the restaurant itself. You consider this array of options and think about how the risk perception feels. The riskiest option, obviously, is eating outdoors. The least risky is getting takeout and eating at home. And it feels like a pretty good compromise to get takeout and eat it somewhere in a spacious area. However, someone might say that's not our choice option. We also could just make our own food and eat at home. That would be the safest. Now it feels like takeout might be a perfectly reasonable compromise, or maybe the park, definitely not eating outdoors at the restaurant. However, that might not be our array either. It could also be eating indoors in a socially distanced, responsible manner, or even eating indoors in a non-socially distanced, irresponsible manner. When we see this giant array, suddenly eating outside at the restaurant's outdoor seating seems like a reasonable option. The compromise, the responsible option. Eating at home seems really very, very cautious. And eating in a close, unsocially distanced restaurant seems also too risky. The array impacts our perceived risk. Consider masks. This is a discussion we've been having a lot at NC State. What kind of mask should professors wear when they teach? So we could think, well, maybe professors don't need any masks at all. Or maybe they should wear cloth masks. Or maybe they should wear masks with filtration in them. 3 options. And it seems like in this array, the responsible middle option is to wear a cloth mask. However, that's not it. We could also be considering whether professors should wear face protectors, whether they should be wearing face protectors and cloth masks, or even protection that covers the whole head. These are all available for sale on Etsy. When you look at this giant array, considering wearing a cloth mask seems like the least professors can do, literally. But times of change call us to think beyond cognition, how we make logical, utilitarian choices, to the world of emotion. Choices are not just a consideration of attributes, of pros and cons, but rather they create a narrative around our lives, meaning they define us and they create identity for us. I became a mom late in life, and I can remember the incredible change that was to my life, and how even the most mundane decisions about diapers and bottles had epic symbolic meaning. All the parents watching right now can attest to this. The choices you make for your kids are not just about the pros and cons, but are about your family narrative as much as anything. Now, Stanford's School of Design came up with something called design thinking. It's a framework that helps designers, people who create new products, services, processes, operations, to empathize more before they start to design. So to think about the end user before they start to come up with ideas about new products or services. This is a fairly radical change, but one that consumer behavior has been thinking about for decades. In fact, in consumer behavior, we've long understood that any choice that a person makes is at its core about the attributes of the product or the service, the logical utility of that product or service. But then that logical utility is wrapped in the context in which the person makes the choice, just like the use of decision heuristics that we just talked about. And then over that is the cultural lens through which we make our choices, the meaning that those choices have. We never make a choice that is just about utility. It's a more complex onion where all of those layers matter in predicting what people will do. For example, in COVID times, why do people wear masks? Well, there's the logical utility of wearing a mask, the empirical evidence around its health benefits. There's also the context effects, right? Like we just talked about. What kind of mask you want to wear might depend on the options that you're shown. But then on top of that, also impacting your behavior is the cultural meaning that masks have to you. When you wear a mask, do you feel strong, like you're saving lives, a superhero, a super doctor, somebody who is powerful and agentic and looking to help? Or is your narrative different? When you wear a mask, do you feel vulnerable, weak, like a patient, somebody who's having to be taken care of, maybe who's a burden on others? What does a mask make you feel like? Whether it's a strong story in your head or a weak story in your head, those are going to impact you as much as the utility and the context. So I told you before that my particular research is in the psychology of change. And there is one overarching motif that comes out across many of my studies, and I think it might be the silver lining in this pandemic. And that is, for you, as a college class, you have an unprecedented opportunity to create personal and societal change. I found in my research that times of change are amazing opportunities for positive innovation. Change begets change. And so when you look at things that you want to do that are new, and you look at things that society needs to do that are new, there's no better time than when we're in a state of upheaval. Now that may seem counterintuitive, but let me give you 3 reasons from my research why I think this is true. The first is called a change mindset. A change mindset is the idea that we as humans have a lens through which we view our day-to-day choices and behaviors. Oftentimes, it's a very habitual, routine, automatic kind of lens. We do the same things day after day, repeat the same behaviors. And yet, in a time of change, all of that is mixed up. All of those habits are unloosed. All of those threads are cut. And in that new lens, our brain often sees, notices, and is willing to try new things. I once had a thought experiment that involved potato chips. It was about how people predicted their desire for unfamiliar things. So I asked them to take two students, one student who was going through a lot of change in their life, another student who was going through relatively little change, and to think about whether that student would be willing to try a brand new type of potato chip. In fact, what the British call crisps. So they were offered a choice between the Lay's potato chip or a British crisp in an exotic flavor. Now, I asked people to predict the choice that these two students would make. And I said that these two students were either going through not much change in their life or a lot of change, new job, new place to live, things like that. And what I found over and over again is that people predict that someone who's got a lot of change already in their life is going to want the familiar comfort of the Lay's potato chip, where somebody who's kind of in a rut, doing the same old, will be willing to try the unfamiliar thing. And that is the prediction that happened consistently over many different iterations of this study. And yet, I then shifted the study, got to order a great big box of British crisps from the UK, and I did the study for real. I took people and I offered them a choice between the familiar potato chip or the unfamiliar British crisp. And I measured how much change and upheaval they had going on in their own life at that time. Again, many different iterations of this study, some even with different things that were not food, different things that might also be considered familiar or unfamiliar choices. And I found a consistent pattern. People who are going through more change chose the unfamiliar thing. People who were in their same old habits chose the familiar brands, the familiar options. And so this is really counterintuitive to us. We think that in times of change, we're going to hold on to the things that are familiar, that bring us comfort. And yet, as humans, really what happens is that when we're in times of change, our eyes are open to all the different things, the different options in the world. And as a result, we are likely to change and more likely to choose unfamiliar things. How does this impact you? Oh, in any number of ways. Some people have taken up sourdough baking. Some people have taken salsa lessons. We see all the different ways in which people have adopted strange, exotic, unfamiliar, new activities into their day-to-day pandemic existence. And it's this change mindset that's helping fuel it. Second is the concept of combinatorial play. Now, this is something that Einstein called the foundation of productive thought. The idea is that when you look at different domains and you combine different things from different domains in a playful sort of manner, great and even genius things can happen. So, for example, what happens when an artist isn't able to have people come into their art gallery? Well, art galleries are buildings. Buildings contain art. That's kind of the way we see a collection of art. But what if we mash up the art gallery concept with the McDonald's concept? So when fast food was opening back up, artists and art galleries looked at that and said, you know what? We can also do drive-through art. And so they created really wild things, art curations, art galleries, exhibitions that were drive-through. And who knows? Given our very busy lives, maybe that's an innovation that will stick past the pandemic. Or consider the mashup of fashion and engineering, especially biomedical engineering, where smart fabrics can be used to monitor temperature, heart rate, especially looking for changes in sustained temperature and heart rate that might be indicative of a fever. I think add that to animal migratory software that we've seen in other lectures here, and you might be able to actually see the virus walking among us in real time. It's that combination of radically different worlds that creates brand new ideas and does so in electric kinds of ways. And finally, number 3, we've seen a real shift in our society away from perfectionism. A colleague at Wharton and I recently wrote a paper about how this shift away from perfectionism is fueling innovation by creating an urgency around trying things, doing something, things that allow us to tinker in the field with situations, trying fast failure, trying things and being okay if they don't at first succeed. In fact, we can see it in our own lives. And so we see people who are baking sourdough be just as willing to share pictures of their failures as with their perfect bakes. We see parents being really honest about how homeschooling is going. We see everyone taking that Instagram lens off of their lives and being okay with the idea of trying, failing, trying again, tinkering, fixing, improving, things that in the innovation world sometimes get away from us. When people are doing new product development, it's very tempting to get a product or a service or an idea just right before you launch it, and sometimes you miss your window. A great example of how this can really stymie innovation comes from a success during COVID. The story of a husband and wife team, she a medical doctor, he a research engineer, were having dinner one night. They were wondering, how could we possibly have more masks? The wife said, gosh, I wish we could just wash them. And the husband said, I think my company once did a study about that. We might be able to. Within 15 days of that dinner time conversation, Battelle was making and shipping the Battelle decontamination units all around the country to help hospitals. Now, are those units perfect? Probably not. But the whole concept here is that with a pandemic, with a crisis, this urgency to do something gives us more leeway for fast failure, for tinkering in situ, for doing things where we get started and we figure things out as we go. It's a powerful form of innovation and one we only see during times of crisis. So the silver lining is this. This is actually the best possible time to change yourself and your world. What do you want to do? What do you want to change about yourself? What do you want to change about the world around you? This is the time to do it. Honestly, probably more than any college class in recent memory, you have that opportunity. John Caldwell was a chancellor back in the 60s, another time of change, and he told students, think big. Think big about your possibilities in the world. And I want to say the same thing to you. Think big. Your possibilities have more traction and more motivation and more momentum than many before you. So, welcome to the Wolfpack. I, for one, can't wait to see what you think and do and change.